So I would now like to welcome the Dean of the College of Biological Sciences to say a few words, Dr. Valerie Forbes.
Thanks, Alex. I don't know, something about this doesn't quite feel the same as doing this at one of our local breweries. So I hope you all have an essential beverage of your choice next to you to enjoy with the program. Welcome to the College of Biological Sciences Petri Dish. As some of you know, this is one way that we try to share our science with the community. And we are really happy that you've decided to enter today our virtual Petri Dish and be part of our newest experiment. And I do encourage you to be active participants. So for these conversations, we bring together people from our college, the university, and beyond who have expertise and a point of view to share around topics that have a biological bent and that touch us all in one way or another. So this afternoon, we're going to hear perspectives on aging. Now, if that isn't a topic that touches us all, I don't know what is. Americans spend enormous amounts of time, energy, and money trying to stave off the effects of aging with various degrees of success. COVID-19 has added another layer of complexity since it appears to impact older people more. Untangling the mix of genetic and environmental factors that affect how we age is complicated, but we're learning more all the time, and we'll hear about some developments in the field today. I'm confident that most of us here are on board with the idea of staying healthier longer or extending our health span. So hopefully we'll have some reason to be hopeful after hearing from Dr. Niedenhoffer and Dr. Shippy. So with that, I hope you'll join in with your own questions and comments. Thank you again for being here, and please enjoy the discussion.
Thanks,
Alex, over to
you. Oh yeah, we should throw like in the news. I like this. Thank you. That was fantastic. So I'm excited for this conversation about aging. I think it is going to be very cool. Before we start, though, I want to ask the audience, please submit questions. We do want to hear from you. Unlike our live events, we're going to be checking in every so often with Claire, who's running a bunch of stuff in the back end there. I think you've heard from her a little bit already. And so what I would encourage you to do is to submit your questions via the chat function. And your message will go directly to staff behind the scenes. It's not going to be visible to the other attendees. And then the staff is going to aggregate the questions and try to get the most frequently asked questions through to us as we break a few times throughout. And we'll still have question period at the end as well. So now I would like to introduce our two panelists. I am also going to, in addition to giving them a little time to talk about what they're doing, I am going to ask them what they are most looking forward to about getting older. I will also share as part of this, I am really looking forward to nobody asking me to help them move ever again. I have been bought off with beer and pizza too many times. So with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Laura Niedernhofer. She's a professor of biochemistry and molecular biology and biophysics and the director of the Institute on the Biology of Aging and Metabolism, one of 4 medical discovery teams at the medical school sponsored by the state of Minnesota. Her work focuses on studying fundamental mechanisms that drive aging, and she is developing therapeutics to target them. I'm going to applaud. Welcome, please.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. I would say the thing I'm looking forward to the most in getting older would be time to read. I feel like I read for my job, and I just don't have enough time to enjoy magazines and literature. And so I really look forward to that. I would have said travel, but not so much anymore.
Not at the moment, less appealing.
Yeah. So I'd love to tell you why I'm so excited about my work, but first, could I give you a little story about the Fountain of Youth? And yeah, that is, I heard a real plausible story about it. So Ponce de Leon discovered a Fountain of Youth in Florida, and everybody thinks, oh, that's just nonsense. But I heard of an explanation that might make it real, and that is, we've learned in science that young blood helps rejuvenate old organisms. And so we can talk about that later if you like.
That sounds more like vampires to me.
It does. It does. But there's a possibility if you went into fresh water in Florida, you would get enough leeches on you that you would get all the old blood sucked out and you'd have young blood again.
Appealing.
No, not really. Not the way to go.
Specifically what you're researching?
No, not at all. But I liked it. It was just at least plausible to think of a fountain of youth. But I would say I got into the field partly because of passion. So I really started out thinking about the marginalization of old people. And I wrote my college essay on that. And I started to do research on rare genetic diseases that are pediatric diseases, but cause children to age in a very quick way. And that worried me. Then I spent part of my career in a cancer center, and I got really worried about cancer survivors and the fact that they were aging quickly. And then I moved on to aging itself, because as you think about sort of the global population and how it's getting older very dramatically, I think it's an impactful area to work in. And we're always, I think, as scientists trying to find big impact and significance to your research. But I would say most importantly, the thing that really gets me going is aging is one of the most complex biologic problems out there. And so it's just fascinating, it's intellectually stimulating. And I have to collaborate with people all across the campus, all, policymakers, transplant surgeons, neuroscientists, epidemiologists, I mean, everybody, because it's really a complicated problem from society level to biology. So it's super, super fun area to be in.
Very cool. Up next is Dr. Tatiana Shippy, who is an associate professor in the Division of Health Policy Management, School of Public Health. Dr. Shippy is a social gerontologist whose work focuses on improving quality of life and quality of care in older adults. As part of her research, she spent 2 years living in a long-term care facility. So she may have some great insights into what she's looking forward to. I'm clapping again, so welcome.
Thank you so much, Alex. I love your enthusiasm, and good afternoon, everybody. Such a pleasure to be here. I love this idea for active engagement. So similar to Laura, my entree into aging, I say, has been driven by passion and opportunity, I would say, coincidental opportunities along the way. So I'm originally from Ukraine and have a law degree from Ukraine. So when I came here to United States, I was planning on getting a law degree here as well. And for my undergraduate, I focused on sociology, which is often used as an entree to law school. But as I was doing that, I took a course on sociology of aging. And as part of that course, we had to interview an older adult. The person that I interviewed was a professor emeritus from this college who was in his late 80s, was half paralyzed from having a stroke, and yet was still living at home in his big, large southern house. This was in the state of Tennessee, taking care of his wife who had dementia. He was so adamant about not moving her into a long-term care facility because he wanted to ensure she had stability. And so, long story short, I ended up actually moving with them, free housing when you're an international student, but I have been, and helping out and getting to know them. He was my reference letter for graduate school. But from this experience, and then moving on to live in a long-term care facility, as you said, for 2 years, I have seen so much resilience that has come with aging, right? This colleague, this friend and mentor that I mentioned, late 80s, half paralyzed with stroke, and yet his ingenuity, his creativity, he kept coming up. He was a professor of chemistry. He kept coming up with all different inventions, and he did assure really great quality of life as best as he could for himself and his wife. So I have been really encouraged by examples such as his, and I'm really excited to be doing this work. To answer your question, what I'm looking forward to with aging, mine's going to be similar to Laura's. I was going to say to take things, to slow down a little bit. I feel like, we're in these different, much of the work I do, the theoretical frameworks, we talk about stages of life course. And I feel like I'm in the stage of life course, raising children, working full time. We're always rushed for things. And I'm hoping that as I get older, I can slow down and kind of do that proverbial, slowing down to smell the flowers. Take it easier a little bit, have time to read, because certainly those are some things to look forward to.
So before we begin the stuff I really wanted to talk about, I am curious because you both had sort of the same kind of answer. Don't you feel like you would want to rush more if you had less time? I feel like I'm going to want to ramp it up because there's only so much time left. I don't know.
I'll start by that. So I'm trained as a social gerontologist, as Alex shared. I have a dual PhD in gerontology and sociology. So I love talking about social and psychological theories of aging. And so one of the very common theories of aging actually is called socio-emotional selectivity theory. And what it means in common jargon, what the theory hypothesizes, and it's been empirical.
Lots of common things. So thank you.
As people get older, they actually prioritize and invest in fewer relationships, but the ones that are really meaningful. So rather than rush and do more, people seem to take in less, but in a more intense way. So rather than broad, it goes deep and rich, but not broad and maybe as.
So you're saying I'm not going to be able to resist. I'm going to slow down and I'm going to hang out with fewer people. All right, I might try to ease into it.
But Laura, you might have a different answer.
Well, I think you see examples of people who do speed up, right? It's like, I'm busier in my retirement than I've ever been before. I hear that all the time. So I think it maybe just depends on your personality and if you feel you ended your career or reached your goals during your work life. And if not, I'm sure many of us will carry on.
Well, that's good. All right. So there's some hope, maybe. We'll see. So I guess the first thing I really wanted to start off with is just kind of the basic general idea of the background of aging. I mean, I'm not necessarily sure I even know, like, what is aging? I mean, is it really just a number on a calendar? Is this linear thing that as we move forward? Or is it a process that we experience that's independent of time? That's both like scientific and philosophical. But I'm gonna wrap them up.
Well, I would just say that one thing that defines aging is heterogeneity. It is so completely different between individuals. Certainly there are families where you see clusters of centenarians and they might age in a very similar and healthy way. But the heterogeneity just frightens me, because what we would like to do is learn how to measure your biologic age as opposed to your chronologic age. So divorce how you're doing from what it says.
What my body is doing.
Exactly.
Chronological.
Yeah.
The calendar tells me I'm so old.
Exactly. We have to stop using your driver's license for entering your medical record, right? We want to know biologically, how are you doing to make good decisions about your care and what's next for you. So, but we don't have the tool set yet. We're still learning.
I'm glad you mentioned the distinction between chronologic and biological age, and I would also add subjective age. And so again, as a social gerontologist, I think about aging as a process that's a combination of a complex social, psychological, and biological processes. And so where some of my work has actually been moving, similar to what you mentioned, Laura, in collaboration with folks across different disciplines, across campus, it's in looking in chronological, functional, or biologic age and subjective age. And subjective age has been a new phenomenon kind of in social sciences, where it's individuals' own assessment in how old they feel relative to their chronologic age. And research has actually shown that that sometimes is more predictive of their health outcomes than just that number that we have in our driver's license.
Interesting.
Great. I am never going to stop using whoopee cushions on people. So I think, so it's interesting that you guys have put this in this context of, that there are different facets of that, of aging in terms of both time that is sort of linear versus our biology versus how we feel about things. And I guess one of the things that when we talk about aging, people immediately just breathe in a fly.
Woo! In the winter, now that it feels like winter.
Extra protein. And so pardon me, I apologize, degradation or senescence. We're talking about, quality of life moving forward. And so that's come up a little bit, and Dr. Forbes talked about that some as well. And so is senescence, or is the aging components that we think of in terms of reduction in, these are going to be terrible words you're going to hate, vitality or whatever else, does that begin essentially from birth? Or does that process of now my joints ache, And, you know, I pulled my neck while I was asleep a few weeks ago, which made me realize I'm not even in good enough shape to sleep anymore. That like, does that process begin later in life, or does it kind of start from the beginning?
I would say both, just to be completely unclear. So I think
That sounds good.
I think there's really clear examples of, say, organs in your body that sort of age in a more linear or I'm thinking of your skin, for example. The more sun you get, the faster it's going to age, and you'll be able to see it. And
see, every year I lived in Arizona. Yes.
Yep. So there's certainly examples where it can be quite predictable in terms of the pace and how you are exposed to certain things. But I also am a firm believer that aging snowballs at the end. And that's because there's so many diseases that aging is the #1 risk factor. And so when you hit a certain age and you're suddenly vulnerable to so many diseases, I think that's when things tend to snowball.
Now, just for my own clarity, and before I apologize if I've jumped in, Tatiana was hoping to speak, but just for my own clarity, when you say diseases, do you mean specifically just things like viral, bacterial, pathogenic kinds of things, or do you mean the whole range of things that can go wrong?
It's really a range of chronic diseases. So certainly your response to environmental pathogens is affected as you get older, but your risk of heart disease, your risk of Alzheimer's disease, your risk of cancer, it goes up virtually exponentially in older age. And that's sort of collectively. I wanted to throw this in as actually a trivia question too. It's like, if we know high blood pressure is a risk factor for heart disease, but if you put just being old on the same scale, how much would you guess that just being old raises your risk of heart disease?
Well, I'm old beyond my years, and I would guess a lot.
Yeah, it's like 1,000-fold. It's exponential. And so something, you know, beyond the age 65, 75, depending on your biologic age, really kind of makes things worse towards the end. And we see clustering of diseases in some individuals. But I'm really interested in not just the biological aspects. So this is important that you've paired us. So
yeah, I know, it's a great combination. You know what I would say, I mean, certainly agreeing with what Laura shared, but kind of as a social gerontologist, right? We absolutely see aging as a complex process and heterogeneous process. So what we like to talk about is the variance also, right? Like we often say after age 65, kind of policy purposes, you know, when Medicare kicks in, but there are these 3 common groupings that have been examined, at least, and created in social gerontological work: the young old, medium old, and the oldest old. And so the young old are folks ages typically 65 to 75, 75 to 85 is the medium old, and after the age of 85. And so, right, we do know that age is a pretty potent predictor, right, of a number of other, having higher prevalence of a number of other chronic conditions and mortality, especially in those medium old and oldest old groups, but certainly variability within each group. And some of the work that I've done and have been interested in this idea of a terminal drop. And that is that there is what, and researchers, health services researchers have looked at this, and that's sort of 1 or 2 years before individual's death. We have noticed kind of this rapid decline of organs, right? And rapid increase in a number of conditions that some have used as a signal of impending mortality.
So that actually segues into something that I am curious about. So we're talking about aging. We're talking about it in terms of health specifically. And so as all of these things start to coalesce at the end, we talk about the number of diseases that you're more likely to get as you get older. But why are we? I was curious. Why are we studying aging specifically rather than all those individual diseases? And is there something that is in common about aging that all those things share? Why is studying aging a useful and good approach, I guess?
Yeah, I love that question. Laura, do you want to go first? I could start. I'm happy to.
Go ahead. Why don't you tackle it first?
Yeah, well, I think, again, a really, really good question. And so, again, as a social gerontologist, I have a degree in gerontology and sociology. We often talked about that, right? Like, what's unique about aging? Why do we think about aging as a process? And I think what's so important about aging, rather than start studying a particular condition, you know, diabetes or cancer or heart failure separately, is that aging, as Laura shared in the beginning, is a complex combination of all these processes, you know, biological processes, but also psychological processes that are happening together. And yes, we view aging in social gerontology as sort of a process from birth to death, and it happens differently for different people, but it certainly accelerates in later life. And so it will have a differential impact on these different conditions, like we know multimorbidity. So having more than one chronic condition is very common in later life. And so we will not look at just one condition on its own, but how it's interacting with other existing conditions that an individual has. So geriatrics, for example, is such an important approach then. But Laura, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, the other topic I would bring up is what's called the Gero science hypothesis. And so this is what's driving the field right now in biology of aging. I know, really trendy. Gero science hypothesis, don't forget it. But the idea is, sorry, what?
I said, does it involve leeches?
No leeches at all. But the idea came actually from the National Institutes of Health. And they were kind of starting to get concerned that there's an institute for almost every category of disease or organ, but very little attempt to interact. And when you start talking about aging, you have to have all of the institutes and all the expertise interact. So they created this Gero Science Task Force, and they came up with this idea that if aging is the #1 risk factor for so many diseases, why not try and build a drug for aging? So you therapeutically target something about aging. And that way you wouldn't need a drug for your heart and for your brain and for your cancer and for your liver. And so the hope was we could develop therapeutics that would target aging itself, and that would be one intervention that would hit a number of diseases and prevent them or delay them or attenuate them all in one fell swoop.
It's the silver bullet approach.
It is the silver bullet approach. You're absolutely right. But the thought is the biology of aging is more tractable in that case because it's more universal than, say, 60 different types of cancer. They differ much more. So that magic bullet never worked. But I think aging is more fundamentally the same in all organisms. So the thought is that this is important because right now there's so many aged people that have multiple diseases that if you cured just one disease, you actually wouldn't make a healthier population. It just wouldn't work. They'd still have 2 other diseases. And so let's take a stab at trying to target aging instead and see if we can get healthier people.
So it's the idea of trying to treat whatever is making people more susceptible to all of these things, as opposed to trying to only treat the outcome of that susceptibility.
Perfectly said.
Whoa, that was the first time. Excellent. So at this point, I would like to take a little break from our conversation and check in with Claire and find out if there are burning questions that the audience just needs to know the answers to right now.
Yeah, so I can jump in. We already have a couple questions.
Hi, Claire.
Hello, everybody. I am the voice behind the scenes, but not anymore. So I'm going to ask just 2, and then there's one that I'm going to ask a little later. So how much of the aging process can you attribute to genetics, and how much to environmental factors?
Ooh, that's a good question.
Yana, do you want to take that? Or?
You know, I don't know that I have a direct answer to that because clearly we know genetics and environment have this important interaction, which does contribute to aging differently. I don't know that I have the number. You know, I think about sort of social determinants of health more broadly in health services research, but I don't know that I've really seen direct calculations. Have you, Laura?
I think I've seen them, but I'm not sure I could say I trust them entirely. I would just say that I am very confident in saying that more than 50% is environmental. And I think that's getting more and more exaggerated as we see poverty and density of population and just, inequities in the world.
Yeah, what we usually do as a health services researcher, I'm sure you've seen this number quite a lot, that about 70% of variability in individual outcomes as a whole is due to environmental influences, and about 30 or so is typically attributed to non-environmental influences. And I will also share that I have helped develop a theory called cumulative inequality theory. It's been pretty widely used in the last 10 years. And what the theory posits is that inequalities we see throughout the life course typically increase in later life. So as you were saying, Laura, the environmental influence seems to only increase over time and become even more prominent in later stages of life. So I don't know the exact number, but I agree that it's more than 50% from what I've seen.
Oh, those whiskeys and bacon cheeseburgers are going to catch up with me. This is what I'm hearing.
But there is also resiliency. So
it gives you opportunities to influence your future.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just making bad decisions is all I'm saying.
Someone asked a follow-up to this is kind of the environment. How do things accumulate over time, and do these environmental and kind of individual choices accumulate over time?
I'll start by saying that accumulation is one of the most frequently used terms, actually, at least in social gerontology. So this theory that I referenced to, it's called cumulative inequality theory. We wrote it in a premise, and this was at least 13, 15 years ago when we developed it. At that time, when we searched for the term cumulative or accumulation, we got hundreds of hits. So very common, accumulation of senescence, right? And so it's commonly used in biology of aging, I believe, as well. What does it really mean, and how do we measure accumulation, right? And so that's something that we were wrestling with in creating this theory, because theories for social scientists help us sort of develop hypotheses and test them. And so what we've found in that, or what we've developed in that theory, we have different axioms. And one of the axioms state that it's the accumulation of available resources, and those could be structural resources, like in our case, maybe access to healthcare, individual agency, and agency could be those, health behaviors a person is taking on, and risks or disability or disadvantage that one is sort of exposed to will ultimately influence outcomes. So looking in interaction of those individual and structural factors, health behaviors are part of that, agency that one can take on. Laura, what do you think?
Well, I think accumulation is an abused word. We don't know much about it, even in terms of biology. But if I were to answer the question simply, I would say just think about your knees, how much running you did and how much they hurt now. There is some examples.
Moguls, don't ski moguls. Yeah, right. That was a mistake. Well, thank you, Claire, for coming in with questions. We'll check back in with you soon. So we wanted to have you both on to talk about aging for a little while now, and it does seem like it's perhaps even more timely now, given the associations with risk through COVID and age, and so I guess I want to talk a little bit about that, of course, because no one can talk about anything besides COVID anymore. It's a rule, I'm pretty sure. But also it's very relevant to our topic today. So in basic terms, I guess I'm trying to make sure I'm set up properly before I ask stupid things, and then it will just be my fault. What is the interaction between COVID and a person's age?
Well, I think the social impact is huge. So why don't you start, please, Tatiana?
So clearly, as you said, now with COVID, and I've talked a lot about this with my own research, but also in interacting with policy stakeholders and media. I think COVID has exaggerated some of the disparities that we've already seen, and it also has brought some things to the surface that were sort of invisible, but we knew them because we were studying them. And one of those has been ageism, I would argue. So yes, absolutely, we have seen an association between older age and higher likelihood of contracting COVID and more serious consequences, but it's how it has been described in, political leaders to, there are many examples that one could draw, or like the Twitter handle, boomer removal, if you guys have seen that.
Yeah, super classic.
The idea that older adults are displaceable, right? And many of those really pejorative terms that have been used toward older adults and the COVID prevalence. And so I think as we're discussing COVID, and aging, we really need to be mindful of ageism, right? Which is, and really ageism has already been on the rise. The World Health Organization has described ageism as one of the key societal issues that's facing most countries. It has been on the rise already, and I think COVID has really made it very prominent. And it seemed as though this is one of these like forms of discrimination and mistreatment that somehow seems acceptable. It's okay to describe older adults as, displaced, as replaceable, as frail, as other, and versus seeing the value that we all have regardless of age. Yeah. So Laura, back to you.
Thanks.
You're stealing my job.
Well, I would add that I think as a biologist, there's a biology of aging that makes the elderly particularly susceptible to bad outcomes in COVID. And so we are testing our geroscience hypothesis in preclinical models right now to see if that's true, and there might be therapeutic ways to intervene. But they're also vulnerable because they often need help, and there's strange and very mixed messages about policies of whether folks can have access to health care workers, and nursing homes, of course, are very enclosed spaces that are going to, foster increased spread. So for a lot of reasons, the elderly are very vulnerable, but I'm particularly concerned about if they become infected, that adverse outcomes are just predictable.
So we've touched a little bit on the idea that as you age, you become more susceptible to a range of diseases. Is this any different? Or is COVID just the latest disease that you are more susceptible to as you get older?
Well, I would jump in and just say, I think that this doesn't surprise me. So we know that the elderly, for instance, are not really good responders to vaccines. So we know there's some immune problems as you get older, and your immune system doesn't respond the way we'd like it to, or the way a young person does. So to some degree, it was predictable. To me, this would have been about as furthest from my thought in terms of testing the geroscience hypothesis. I would have liked to have done it in Alzheimer's or heart disease or the classic age-related diseases. But this gives us a real opportunity to challenge that. And I think we've got data to show that indeed, if you have an old biology, you're very vulnerable to these viral pathogens. And there may be ways to target aging to prevent those adverse outcomes.
Tatiana, do you have anything?
Yeah, I think I will let Laura speak on that one. For me, it makes sense in terms of like overall immune response, viral response, multimorbidity, susceptibility. So I'm not surprised. But again, for me, it's how we frame, how we support older adults with COVID, and how we view them as key members of our society and not as a boomer removal trend for, well, great, now we have fewer older people to worry about.
So
can I ask just quickly, Tatiana, if you were to make a prediction when they say deaths due to COVID, when you think about the elderly population, don't you think they're missing a whole swath of them, those that didn't get the care or didn't have the staff person with them or didn't? It worries me that there's some ancillary deaths that we're not accounting for, and I just don't think that's fair.
Oh, I'm sure. And when we talk about older adults being at high risk for COVID, I would also want to bring in, like we talked about COVID exacerbating existing disparities. Besides older adults, we know the other groups that have been highly vulnerable to COVID have been Black, Indigenous, and other persons of color at 3 times higher rates than white people. And so I think what COVID susceptibility also is showing is this, we talked about environment versus biology, right? That environmental vulnerabilities, environmental disadvantage also places one at a higher risk of COVID, regardless of age. So, and we know that, living in a certain facility places one at a higher risk of COVID. So, biology clearly is important, but these societal, social factors also play a role. Yeah.
So Laura, you brought up that people as they age don't respond to vaccines as well. To me, the brain and the immune system seem like the 2 things that we really don't have a great handle on yet. So I might be, throwing you under the bus here a little bit. I don't know. But what do we know about the immune system as we age, as our immune system, I assume, ages with us similarly. And does that relate to this and perhaps some of the other disorders?
Well, my first piece of advice, Alex, is find a really good immunologist, because that's really complicated.
Well, then I'm not going to understand it if they give me a complicated answer.
I'll give you the simple answer, which is about as much as I understand it. And that is, there are huge shifts in your immune cell populations, and you can think of it as kind of getting old and tired. You don't have the resilience in your immune system to respond to new pathogens. So you don't respond to a vaccine or a new COVID so there's certainly some weakening or just some exhaustion of the immune system as we get older. And the brain, that's a really complicated.
I wasn't going to get into that. There's like these two things that seems like when I ask questions, people are like, there's this black box of stuff and we know the things that come in and go out, sort of. So, and those are kind of the two things that I thought about. So I didn't necessarily expect here's the way it works, kind of. So,
thank you.
No, don't worry. But, and Tatiana, you were talking about how societally we've kind of approached this as if some of the people that are dying of this, if they are in care facilities or they are in hospice and may die this year anyway, it tallies up the same number of deaths for like the bean counters. But I watch how wrong I might be on this, but I have heard that there is a possibility that there may be long-term damage associated in some cases with COVID. And I wonder, and I'll circle back to you, Laura, in terms of like what that might mean in terms of aging process stuff. But I do wonder if, disease hitting younger people causing long-term effects as they age might change, not that I want that, but might change some of that view. And in terms of how do we approach something that might do that?
Yeah, I'll just, start by saying that, yes, I have seen this, I have heard this kind of proposition as well, that, well, many of these folks, older adults who are dying, they have multiple conditions. They, could have died anyway. And the fact is that all of us are going to die, right? And so the fact that somebody has, multiple conditions and they would die anyway, in fact, does not make them replaceable, right? It is premature mortality.
I'm not arguing that that's the case.
Right. And I know you are not saying it. I just wanted to be very clear that we are, I know you are not saying that. So, so that is just kind of like the reminder, I think, for all of us about this. Yeah, we are all mortal. We're all going to die. And the piece about younger adults, right? I am not an epidemiologist, but I've certainly read a number of convincing pieces that show that younger adults who contract COVID and don't die from COVID are exhibiting long-term symptoms and potential, impacts on their health. I describe myself also as a life course researcher, and that is we're trying aging again is a process from life to death from birth to death for us. And so we try to understand how outcomes in later life are influenced by exposures earlier in life, duration of exposure, onset of exposure. And so in this case, I would say sort of two things. The skeptic in me might say, well, certainly our society values younger people much more than we value older people. And so maybe now that we're starting to get this data that guess what, younger people who don't die, but have these life potentially long-term consequences, maybe now we will place even more importance on trying to address it. Because before it was like, well, it's just for older people, let's go live on our lives. And, these older people, they're sort of on the fringes of society anyway. So maybe we're going to care more. But on the other side, I will also say that it is highly concerning because we do know there's lots of research on early origins of health, again, life course research, which shows that outcomes that we face, biological premature aging that we face in later life is a result of our exposures, cumulative exposures over the life course. So we don't know yet now because we need more time to trace it, but we might see that folks who have had COVID and maybe didn't even seemed asymptomatic, that they might have different sort of profiles of aging compared to those who didn't contract COVID.
You're also just reminding me more that those years in the Arizona sun are going to come back and haunt me, but.
You might be one of those resilient ones. I don't know.
So Laura, I'll throw it to you.
Well, I have to say, I've had the great good fortune of hanging out with some really smart physician scientists in a number of disciplines, and COVID is still baffling a lot of people. It's really not clear what would cause. Yeah. So we're not clear what's driving, you know, prolonged illness in younger individuals. I have my biases, and I'll give you my biased view, and that is, as we have been looking at pillars of aging or things that might be druggable in terms of aging, one of the things we focused on is senescent cells. And so these are cells that have been stressed for a number of different reasons, and they turn off the ability to make new cells to protect your body, but they're very pro-inflammatory. So we think that one thing that could be contributing to bad outcomes in COVID, whether you're young or old, is maybe a burden of senescent cells, because they're so pro-inflammatory that once you get a virus on top of that, you kind of explode into this cytokine storm that everybody talks about. And that can damage your organs, whether you're young and can recoup some of that. But regardless, that can be very detrimental. And that's your immune system not acting properly, basically. We're back to that.
Well, on that up note, I check back in with Claire. I have a feeling that there may be some questions related to COVID and aging that have come through. Is that true, Claire?
There are some that are related. There's no specific COVID questions, but I think some speak to it. So I'm going to go off that, Laura. I think this ties that in a little bit. So the question relates to what a potential target would be for an anti-aging drug. And the participant asks, would it be senescent cells or would it be something else?
Well, we in the field have come up with, say, 8 hallmarks, or it can be 10 depending on the day, 8 to 10 targets that are potentially out there. They're called the hallmarks or pillars of aging. And they can be very diverse. So senescent cells is one of them. Loss of stem cell function is another. How you respond to your environment and nutrients and stress is another one. And all sorts of flavors of damage that happen to your cells. I think the best evidence that we have right now is the most targetable are the senescent cells, and perhaps sort of those tied into nutrient sensing. So that ties into all the exercise literature and caloric restriction and things like that. So those are the most targetable at this point.
I'll just leave it at that. I think Laura, most expertise in answering that question.
Great. And I'll do one more before we go on to the final section of questions. And this was asked in similar iterations by multiple people. Are there any effective ways or promising ways to improve one's resiliency to age-related diseases or to basically live longer? And I know that's kind of a $1 million question, but
leeches, I heard
people
recently.
are wondering, yeah, a leech bath. You can head to northern Minnesota and do that.
Yep.
You know, I could start by sharing that I don't know if maybe some of the participants are familiar with the work or the book called Blue Zones. So that was, are you familiar with that work, Laura? But yeah, it's been pretty popular, kind of popularized in by media. And what that work does, it examines people who live the longest and in places where people live the longest. And it has a variety of different places. So like Sardinia versus, I think there's a group in California, in the US, there's this one group that has achieved exceptional longevity. And they try to understand what are some of the underlying common factors that are tied to longevity. And in fact, I don't think that they've come up with like a framework that is universal by any means, but they have found, it's interesting, some of these things are more almost attitudinal. I know one of the things that seemed common across all of these was a certain outlook on life, like positive attitude, I guess, lack of neurotic personalities, I know was tied to longevity, but also certain health behaviors and diets. I know in certain places they found like individuals who eat diet that's high in like omega acids. I know like Mediterranean diet, I think was shown for one of them, but not to say that that's been, you know, empirically validated as longevity proof. So there have been certain factors that have been examined from the environmental standpoint, like the dietary intake, outlook on life, social relationships. I know in this particular community in California, it's a tight-knit religious community that has a lot of like social cohesion, part of belonging to the group, a sense of having a purpose in life. I know what was one of those things that they've described. Laura, what would you want to add?
Yeah, I would just amplify what you're saying. I think one of the most important things is identifying what's important to you and going after it. So it could be working like crazy like Alex or reading a book like me, but that is has a huge impact, and there's studies to show that. That ties in with reducing stress because you're going after what you want. I would also add exercise. I hate to tell you, exercise is great. It doesn't take a lot, but you do need some good sleep.
I walked to the fridge and back to the couch. Hoping.
And then the other thing is caloric restriction really stinks. Nobody wants to do it. So there's a new kind of a cult following of something called compressed eating. So this is much more tolerable, and it actually has been shown to work even up through primates, where you just limit the number of hours in a day that you consume calories. And what that does is prevent your glucose from spiking all the time and your hormones being released to respond to it. And so if you can skip breakfast, not like your mom told you, skip it, have a late lunch and have an early dinner, that seems to have a huge benefit. But it's all about extending healthy aging and not lifespan. And I would also say just stay aware of the literature, because this field is moving like gangbusters, and there will be therapeutics within 10 years.
But I just wanted to add to the exercise piece. Clearly, there's so much evidence showing the value of exercise. But what's interesting from all of these communities is that they were not like exercising on the exercise regimen. They stayed highly active. I know reading about folks who, lots of walking because that's part of their lifestyle, gardening. And so I think it's part of this idea of exercise that's part of a lifestyle, because that's what they do, versus, exercise on the regimen, which I'm sure is still effective, but probably harder to build into one's everyday life. So thinking how to make that naturally happen is probably, more conducive for some.
So I see that we are close to out of time here. I feel like, Claire's given me the eye on that. However, I did want to cover just really quickly a little bit about sort of where this is going. And Laura, you just mentioned therapeutics, and previously you were talking about pharmaceuticals. And I'm curious, as we look at dealing with age-related disorders, are we sort of invariably talking about taking more pills? I mean, that's one of the big ones that I'm curious about. Is that the future of increased vitality into age? Is just lots more pills?
Nope, I would say quite the opposite, actually, very happily. So the idea with the Gero science hypothesis and developing a therapeutic to target aging is you would take one intervention, and not one for your heart disease and one for your diabetes and one for your arthritis. So there'd be one. The other thing that's really appealing about this approach is, for instance, if you were clearing senescent cells, if that's your target with the drug, you might only have to take the pills every quarter of the year, or just occasionally until the cells came back. So we're really looking at regimens that are much fewer pills. And the other thought is too, exercise, we know it works, but there's some people who can't exercise because they've just had some sort of damage to their joint, or they've put on too much weight. So you use a drug for a little period of time until they can pick up the things that would keep them and sustain them happily exercising and social and out and about. So I think shorter periods of time, less frequent, and one intervention.
I would say that I am very excited and hopeful about the work that you can accomplish with the Gero science hypothesis, because again, as a health services researcher, so I come in on the end of kind of healthcare utilization and quality. Certainly, like polypharmacy is a huge issue. Older adults take, 5, 7, 8, 9 pills on average, depending on their profiles. And we know it's a major problem in, especially adults with cognitive impairment, remembering which pill to take for what. So I think it sounds really promising, and hopefully we could see some advancements in that.
Yep.
So I am curious if it's not, going to be more pharmaceuticals, which sounds fine to me. Although the idea of taking a pill versus exercising a lot. But I, one of the things, Tatiana, that you brought up is some of the social interactions with that. Mm-hmm. And I do wonder, as we're being, doing social distancing and staying away from each other and these types of things, do you think that that is contributing currently then to negative outcomes?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, I would have to agree with that. Unfortunately, I've actually pinned an op-ed about this because I've received so much, a lot of my work is community-based. So I work with family members of residents in long-term care, residents themselves, and other stakeholders. And this was just, so nursing homes, as we know, until recently had no visitation policy because of the COVID transmission risk. And it is, in fact, we know that loneliness and isolation, there's been a study published in Science a few years back, which showed that loneliness has been directly linked to mortality. And in fact, is an underlying cause of premature mortality for many individuals, not just older adults. Younger people actually experience pretty high levels of loneliness and isolation. But yes, with COVID, huge concern is that on one hand, we're focusing on safety of older people, right? On extending their lifespan. We don't want them to prematurely die from COVID. So we're going to limit all of their social interaction, especially for people in residential care settings. But we also know that loneliness and isolation has an incredibly grave risk for worse health outcomes. And we do know there have been studies now coming out which are illustrating the negative effects of isolation and loneliness in older adults. I know I have heard so many stories from many of the older adults and family members I interact with, and especially think for people with cognitive impairment and dementia, where maybe that, for spouses, for partners, people who have not separated for 50, 60 years from each other, and that's the one person that they still recognize. And the sense of confusion, the sense of loss that has been experienced by residents with dementia and cognitive loss because their loved one now hasn't come and visited them in 3 months. It's been a huge concern, public health concern, and I'm very happy that our Department of Health, Minnesota Department of Health, has created some now opportunities for socially distanced visitation, because that was a huge risk. Yeah.
So just as a quick follow-up to that, before I let Laura jump in, does this help? I am
Zoom?
If yeah, well, I mean, not specifically.
Virtual, yeah.
I'm not advertising Zoom as a program necessarily.
Yes.
However, but I mean, virtual interaction, to me at least, as somebody who is, and this might come as a surprise, massively extroverted, this not the same. And so I'm curious for people who are truly lonely and maybe suffering from that versus me, who's whinging, if interactions like this help.
I'll just talk quickly about the research that I've seen. We know that baby boomers on average actually have a pretty high use of social media, Facebook in particular. And so, yes, we do know that older adults have been connecting via social media. And we do know that certain online support groups have been pretty effective and have provided positive supports. But I think when we're talking about older adults in residential care settings, people in nursing homes and assisted living, where they already are short-staffed, and especially if they have cognitive impairment, and we know that about half of nursing home residents have diagnoses of dementia, that's been a challenge in part because they don't have the devices, or they need a staff member to provide a device for them. So I know, again, family members have reached out to me. They're trying to call their loved one. They want to see them on Skype, FaceTime, Zoom, whatever platform you're using, but they need a staff member to provide support. And they've been in so short staff that actually, for the most vulnerable people, and again, for people with dementia and cognitive impairment, for nobody, I think it replaces the in-person interaction, but it's been a big challenge to use. But certainly that's something that we have to continue trying to do to at least lessen the negative impact of COVID. Yeah.
Makes sense. So Laura, I didn't know if I apologize if you wanted to chime in earlier and I cut you off, but
No, not at all. Not at all. I was just going to say, maybe we should take this as an opportunity though, to figure out new tools to keep the elderly or the isolated from being lonely. I mean, this is a pretty prolonged pandemic. And so I think now is the time to build those tools.
Yeah, we're like 20 minutes from forever on the pandemic right now.
Right. So I participated in the National Academy of Medicine annual meeting recently, and Alex, you've done a great job. You came up with the 4 topics that they think are the most impactful in trying to help the elderly in terms of COVID, and that's medications, reducing them and tailoring them, or at least looking at them one more time, because it's every doctor drops a different pill and then mobility, mentation, and finding out what's important for them. And usually it's just being more social or maintaining contact with loved ones. So I think we need to use this as an opportunity to improve what we can do for the elderly, ultimately.
I agree wholeheartedly. And as a person who works in systems change, I think it has to be kind of systems change. And when you think about people in long-term care, it's how we deliver care and how we pay for care, right? Because when you have one LPN on the whole floor who's supporting so many people, it's just impossible for her to be able to facilitate that. Yeah.
I bet. I am curious, and I'll throw this to you first off, I think, Laura, but you'd mentioned that there were some potential things on the horizon. And I guess I'm sort of curious in general terms what that means, and what does that look like? I mean, are we trying to stop the aging process? Is that like the ultimate end goal? Or if that's the case, and even if it's not, what is the end goal? What do we want the end of life? What do we want aging to look like?
Well, I would say, I think what we all would like to be is a centenarian. So they live, first of all, a long time. Second of all, they have on average 20 years of healthy life beyond average. And really important to me, in the last 2 years of life, they spend 2.5 times less on healthcare. So they're not engaged with their doctors or in the hospital all the time. And the majority of them honestly die in their sleep, completely unpredicted. And so that would be the elegant way, is that you remain fit, active, social, engaged, and then I don't know.
I might start having nightmares about comfy beds then at that point.
I could really relate to that comment about dying in one's sleep, living in a long-term care facility. And much of my research is, very intimate interactions and like ethnographic observations in long-term care settings. That's been the death, right? The good death that's described by residents is that one dies when they're still in enough mobility and cognitive health in particular, and they can die in their sleep. I will say that the polls, national polls that have been carried out by ERP and other organizations, find that most people would say if they had to choose, they would choose shorter lifespan, but good quality life, right? So people want this idea of quote unquote compression of morbidity. They want to live the life that they could have with as few conditions as possible. And then when they have to hit this kind of decline phase, that it's as short as possible, right? And that involves as few unnecessary interventions, medical interventions as possible, so that people could focus on what's important for them, whether that's relationships with others, reading their books, and all of it together, right? Sort of focusing on what matters rather than just extending life, adding numbers to the lifespan, but not reducing the morbidity that will come with those extra numbers.
So you mentioned earlier on, though, that there is this sort of trajectory that people have in terms of, this is how I remembered it in my head, you could correct me, their energy or their focus and how much they're looking to interact with the wider world versus focusing on the things that matter in front of them. Will aging research impact that? Is that part of the goal, or is that natural life trajectory something that we want to maintain?
Well, so that was the theory of what's called socio-emotional selectivity, and it's a psychological theory developed by Dr. Laura Carstensen. And what the theory posits is that older adults choose to, so their choice to invest in fewer relationships, because there's been a lot of research which shows, oh, look, now that you're older, people have fewer, like some of those questions about how many people do you have in your different networks, social networks, how many people are your friends, people you interact with, and usually older people have a smaller number than younger people. But what this theory postulates is that that's a selection, that's an intentional choosing on the part of older adults to prioritize. So this is about perception of time left, that as people perceive that they have less time left to live, they choose to invest that time in what matters most to them. And for most older people, it's relationships of their loved ones, so their partner, adult children, and their family members versus building, when we're younger, many other relationships, some of which are, less deep than others. And so the idea is that that's a choice on the part of older adults to prioritize fewer but very deep relationships.
So do I have to wait until I'm older to decide who I can't be bothered with?
Well, we'll just have to see the wisdom that comes with age, right?
Oh, it's not looking good.
But there is certainly heterogeneity. I will just say that in much of my work in long-term care facilities, I have found that people are building new relationships. People are becoming, friends with other residents in particular. It's just the investment that they place on that relationship versus, say, that of their adult children. But things might change too, like cohorts, right? When one is born, there is research which shows that depending on which cohort one is born, we have different kind of normative expectations on, say, when people get married or what's important. And so it might be that maybe millennials, who knows, and this is just a hypothesis, maybe they will place more importance on relationships with their friends or, versus their partner, spouse. So far, those still seem to be very central to older adults, but maybe things will change with cohort changes.
Fair enough. So I don't normally like to end on the sort of stereotypical, well, what's something great that's happening? But it's 2020 and I need it. So I'm hoping kind of as the last thing before we get the last, go back and get some more audience questions at the end, is what is, in terms of aging and understanding of aging, what is something that looks hopeful on the horizon, something beneficial to look forward to? Because I think I'm not the only one that needs to hear something like that now.
Tatiana, you want to go first?
Happy to.
Okay.
Let me think. I don't have the answer, but I'm happy to do it. What I would say, just kind of quick reaction to your question, is that I think we see more interdisciplinary collaboration and greater understanding now that, in fact, team science is the way to really address and understand aging. And so, as Laura described, like the Gero science hypothesis, it's the understanding that we need to draw, one discipline is not going to solve this. We need to truly build interdisciplinary teams that can build on understanding of biological processes, psychological and social processes that are happening with aging in order to be able to move the science forward. So I'm optimistic from that standpoint because I feel like there's been much more investment and collaboration that is happening to address aging, and also bringing in new folks into the field of aging, bringing in people with new ideas, innovative ideas from backgrounds who haven't done aging research. So that's inspiring me, seeing the new cohorts of folks coming up who are willing to work across the aisle to get to solve these complex issues.
Across the aisle, I see what you did there. Yes.
Across the aisle, yes, I gotta throw that in.
No, that's
politics. It never gets out.
A wonderful thing in 2020 building community. I like it.
Yes.
How about you, Laura?
Well, I think Tatiana hit the nail on the head. There's a lot more awareness, and COVID is helping even more. There is certainly even huge international collaborations. I am optimistic that the wealth that a lot of billionaires have accumulated will be dumped into aging research. Bill Gates is interested. There's a number of other individuals that are really supporting research and novel tools and innovation to address this huge need. The WHO is working with the UN. I mean, there's, it's global now, this effort, which I think is really going to move the needle. There's the National Academy of Medicine organized Catalyst Awards, and even pharmaceutical companies are now jumping in and putting money towards this. So that's optimistic. The other thing I would say is, from a biologist point of view or biochemist, we're moving the needle in terms of developing these drugs too. So one of the biggest problems we faced is the Food and Drug Administration said, well, aging is just what happens. It's not a disease, so you can't make a drug for it. But collectively, the field has been able to negotiate with the FDA so that they agreed if we do a pilot clinical trial that is currently designed and will probably start next year, then they will agree that aging is something that is druggable. And in the meantime, people are testing drugs in very small clinical trials.
I was just picturing like tranquilizer darts, druggable. Oh, you look like you're having, anyway.
No, I think it's more like delivering a pint of strawberries to somebody because it has really good natural products in it. So it's not going to be frightening in the least.
Oh, good. That's awesome. Yeah. So I am sure there are some remaining questions. Claire says yes. So take it away.
A lot more questions that we have time for, but I'll do my best. I'll probably send 2 or so your way.
All right.
So one question I think reflects that we probably have some evolutionary biologists on, and they're hoping that the 2 of you can talk a little bit about how aging might relate to evolutionary theories, how evolutionary theories of aging might relate to kind of the aging that we think of. And one of the things that they asked to kind of help spark the conversation is it possible that aging exists because there was no selective pressure for most animals to develop aging prevention mechanisms because they typically died anyways due to predation, disease, or other factors before reaching a certain age?
I think that is spot on. Certainly, there's no selective pressure after your fertility wanes, right? And so first of all, let me say a plug for evolutionary biologists. We need more of them in the field of aging. So come join us, help us. We need help. Yeah, there's no selective pressure after you could no longer bear children and put pressure on these genes. So we even talk about a theory called antagonistic pleiotropy. So what makes you healthy and strong and fertile backfires after as you get older. And that could be ways you adapt to stress or overreact. It might protect you when you're younger, but just really backfire later. So a lot to study. I love studies where you compare species because there's a lot to learn from nature out there. There are organisms that don't age anything like humans. And so there's an awful lot we can learn. Great question.
I clearly can't add to that question from the evolutionary biology standpoint, but I do remember antagonistic pleiotropy from my biology of aging class. I remember something, but I will just say again, as a social gerontologist, when we speak about aging in humans, think about this. We're living during unprecedented time in human history. This is for the first time in our history that we have, in the last 100 years, we have expanded human lifespan. I mean, average life expectancy in the US about 100 years ago was in the mid 40s. And now average life expectancy is in the late to mid 80s. So we doubled it, more than doubled it. We know that the probability of living to 100 is so much higher now. And we will have so many more centenarians than we've ever had in our history. And so I think this is truly, again, an unprecedented time where due to these innovations and inventions in public health as well, we have been able to extend human lifespan in a way we never imagined. And so now we need to figure out how we can actually help people live better during that time as well.
Excellent.
Great. We'll do another one. So someone asked, when you talk about psychological age, is that something that's movable, or is it if you have a higher number at a younger age, is that a permanent state? So can you do better?
Yeah, so I think maybe the subjective age, the question about, how old do you feel versus how old you are. So this one is really interesting, and I've done some research on this. So the key predictors of most people feel younger than their age. It'd be we should have put it in a poll. What age do you feel? And in fact, there have been some recent media stories, if you Google it, somebody who is 50 years old wanting to change their age on their driver's license, so 60, saying that they actually feel much younger, and that's the number that should be reflected. But in all reality, what the research shows that the people who feel younger than their age, again, have a number of positive outcomes. What I have found in some of the research I've published is that key factors that influence feeling older than one's age have been adversity, probably not a big surprise. One of the key ones I identified was losing a child. So among all the different factors we tested, like economic hardship, divorce, so a number of other variety of different adverse scales, losing one's child, probably one understandable. Aged people, I don't remember by how many years, but that was one of the largest. But yes, I do think that this is probably something where agency comes in, and depending on the infusion of resources and social support, subjective aging can fluctuate over time. But we do know, again, that that's a marker that could be used actually for screening for individuals who are at heightened risk for premature mortality.
I just want to chime in. Your examples are so sad.
I am sorry. There are positive ones then. So for people who feel younger, right? Again, it's, you know, positive life experiences, social support, exercise. We do see that those are associated with feeling younger than one's age.
Okay.
So, and Alex, there was actually, I wanted to bring up, there was one study where they brought plants into a long-term care facility and gave.
I'm listening.
Huh?
I'm listening.
Exactly.
I am here at the conservatory.
Exactly.
Conservatory, yeah.
I was going to give you a positive spin on this. They found that if you had a plant or something to care for, you felt younger. So Claire and Alex, you just dropped 10 years. So.
Oh yeah, there you go. Nice.
Not as good as the conservatory, but.
No.
Excellent. So are we out of time? I think, is that?
We're getting close. I can ask maybe one more.
Maybe one more. Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah. So this person asked, what is the most important discovery that you have made? Or maybe you can broaden that of colleagues, or even in your opinion, what do you think is the most important discovery to slow down the aging process?
I mean, if it's
not from you or your lab, but it can be.
I'll go.
Well, I have my own research, and this is in collaboration with other colleagues in my Institute on the Biology of Aging and collaborators at the Mayo Clinic. We've really been at the forefront of developing this new class of drugs called senolytics. So they're called that because they selectively kill senescent cells. And we have a ton of preclinical data that suggests they're going to work in virtually every age-related disease, including bad outcomes in COVID-19 and Alzheimer's and heart disease and diabetes and depression. And they've moved in a matter of 5 years from this discovery to clinical trials. So I am still, we still have to do this very scientifically and rigorously to test these drugs, but I'm very optimistic that maybe this new approach to address the geroscience hypothesis is going to be impactful. We're not there yet, but
does it have silver in it?
The silver bullet, you mean?
That's right. Yeah, you saw where I was going.
Yes. Well, my research doesn't focus on slowing down the process of aging. I will say what I feel has been really important, and I'm really proud to see it, is the collaboration that I have been able to develop, and just the environment that we have here in Minnesota between policymakers, our State Department, providers, and consumers, with us as the researchers, to be able to do some of this work in terms of quality of life and quality of care for older adults. Because I think just as on the hard science part, it takes different diverse teams, interdisciplinary teams, to get this work done. We also need to kind of engage our policymakers, our lawmakers, our State Department that's doing the regulations, to really be able to think how we are implementing some of these solutions that we're coming up with. So that's what I'm really excited about, the collaborative environment that we're building across different stakeholders.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Claire, for bringing us the audience questions. And thank you to all of our audience members who submitted questions. This is always much better thanks to your participation. I also want to thank our panelists one more time. I'm applauding. I know there's not an audience, so it's a whole thing, but yeah, there we go. Yeah.
We'll applaud each other, huh?
So I appreciate you both taking the time to speak with us today. I also really quickly want to just inform everybody about an upcoming event at the Bell Museum on October 27th with naturalist and author of Nature Obscura, a city's hidden natural world. Kelly Brenner will be there. So you can check it out at, and I was given a link here that looks like maybe Claire is doing something magical to load. No, she's doing a background. All right, so if you want to write it down, it is, hey, see, she is doing something magical to load. I knew she would. So, please, feel free to check that out too. It looks very cool. And thank you all so much for, joining us this afternoon. It was fantastic, and I had a great time. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks very much.